So this is our fourth session, and what we've been looking at are practical uses of systems thinking. So this is systems thinking not for the academic or the computer system, but systems thinking really for the practicing innovator. And we've talked so far about just the general uses of systems thinking in the first session, the application of systems thinking to problems and developing solutions, and then the applications of systems thinking to scale. Really, this sort of all begs the question of who is the voice in all of this? How do you create organizations and collaborations that are capable of doing this work? And so this fourth session is really about how do you build creative ecosystems? How do you build ecosystems of different actors, organizations, that can be brought together to deal with particular challenges and creative issues? This is really key when we start getting to issues like the SDGs, where you have big, large challenges that will require multiple actors to come together. And so the solution is not likely to be either creatively or an execution in the hands of just one organization. And that means that you're going to need to figure out new ways to bring organizations and individuals together so that they can creatively address challenges. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the traditional way that we manage a complex task is that we create an integrated end-to-end approach that basically puts someone in charge. It's top-down control that allows you to manage a set of fixed functions. And when you get this right, it's really very powerful because you can rinse and repeat over and over again to deliver out the kind of functionality, the kind of results that that particular organization or group of organizations is designed to do. So it's really a case of creating a formal arrangement that does one thing well. And as long as you've got a stable, consistent thing to do, this makes perfect sense. However, the reality is that many of the challenges that we face in aid or with these sustainable development goals are not so neat and tidy. They are shifting, they are big, they have many different parts which we may not entirely understand at any given time. So it will be much more useful, instead of having one organization or one set of organizations that's been bolted rigidly together to address a problem, to bring together multiple organizations, different actors that can collaborate in perhaps a web or a network that can be used to address a particularly complex problem and adjusting and learning as they go. Now, so instead of having the bottle opener, we really have something that's closer to the Swiss knife. So with all these different organizations working together, you now have the possibility of addressing challenges in multiple different ways, drawing on multiple different skills, and the result is that you have a great deal more power and flexibility. So now here we have systems thinking applied to the idea of a big challenge. And Jenny, you've had some actual experience with this, right?
I have a few times. So the challenge for me is, how do you build one of these powerful ecosystems? How do you build powerful collaborations? Because we know they exist. We've all seen versions of ecosystems that are incredibly powerful and can do far more than any organization on its own. And these kind of virtuous cycles and multiplier effects when you can get different big and small and diverse organizations heading in the same direction in the same system. And I think really this diagram is interesting because it shows that, signals, responses, measuring outputs, but how do you do that in practice? So I'm just using an example from my own experience, but I'm sure there's many more examples from people in the audience. So do feel free to put thoughts in the chat as well. I can't see the chat, but Dan can bring those up if you have thoughts or questions.
I can see the chat.
Amazing. So my experience comes from building the Response Innovation Lab, which is a global ecosystem for humanitarian innovation. And what it does and did was build kind of cluster, if you know UN clusters or hubs in countries that support the whole innovation ecosystem in that country to do better social innovation. So that's kind of bringing people together alongside funding innovations, alongside sometimes creating a place, alongside information, finding innovations that work for various problems. So it's really capability building, it's starting new innovations with multiple different actors on many kinds of problems. And the work I did and the ways we succeeded or didn't really focused on these 5 core capabilities for successful collaboration. The first one being a shared vision. And the Response Innovation Lab, as their core partners, had the 3 biggest NGOs in the world, a think tank and a university. So quite different types of players with quite different visions. And I remember, we were all very excited for supporting innovation and impact in the humanitarian sector. But I remember quite early in one of our workshops in building this, there was obviously conflict and context in the room of people wanting different things. So the smaller organizations wanted to create kind of a nimble kind of organization that could move around and make change quickly, which large organizations couldn't. And some of the larger organizations wanted to change and influence the humanitarian infrastructure for it to be different. And we physically moved in the room as to where each person felt that we should be, and we were all along the kind of wall of the room. And this is senior executives from some of these organisations. But we decided that we would basically move towards shaping the infrastructure. And we shared that vision and we decided that together on an equal playing field. And none of the organisations dropped out, which I found really interesting. So everyone supported that vision, which brings us to the kind of win-win architecture. So once you've got the shared vision, you really need to give everyone the ability to win, feel successful. And again, that's not just budget and being able to do interesting programs, but that's having a role that you feel capable in, that you can show people what you can do and be motivated to do that. So that was fairly easy for us because we had a university, they did the research. We had 3 large organisations, so they set up the country offices, the country coordination piece. And our think tank did quite more kind of could give. So despite the difference in idea of original shared vision, once we came to the agreement and once we could put together that win-win architecture, all of the organisations were fully on board. which then brings us to predictable trust. So how do you establish relationships that can survive not just the ups, but also the downs, the challenges with donors and funding and impact and direction and changes in direction and many other things. And this certainly looks different for different kinds of ecosystems. But predictable trust for us was not just about building equal grounds that we could talk on, being very different organisations, very different sizes, to having decision rights really agreed up front on what kind of decisions different people could make, to having one of the organisations step forward and say, we can actually do some of the harder stuff if we can trade and you are able to do this, and we can kind of trust each other to take these different parts of the problem. And I think certainly, and we all know this, trust between individuals is very important, and it's not just trust between organisations. But certainly we had times where convincing legal departments in global offices was an important part of what our board had to do. You've got trust, and then you need functional integration. And this was incredibly difficult for us because these three very large organisations suddenly needed functional integration, not only at the global level with global policies and security arrangements and IP, intellectual property, the way they dealt with that, but also because this was an operational collaboration, because it was an ecosystem builder in countries. They needed to have similar arrangements for staffing and for sharing staffing and for security protocols for staff. And so it took us 2 years to sign a collaboration agreement while we were already working, while we were all, we had money and programs, because this functional integration was just being thrown back and forth at global legal departments, which is very often the case with these kind of larger ecosystem collaborations. But we certainly got there, and then having that functional integration was an absolute blessing and made everyone's life easier. And you often find that when you don't have the functional integration at the higher levels, what that does is it pushes down to operational levels and causes conflict between different kinds of people. So you really need to be able to make those decisions wherever that functional integration sits, even if it's that, the 300 actors in your ecosystem get to vote on what happens, but leaving those pieces undone leaves conflict to fester all down the chain. And the final piece, so I was just going to say, moving away from the Response Innovation Lab for a moment and talking about technology, because functional integration is important to that as well. Just some of the challenges that come, and we're certainly seeing this with lots of different technology growing out of UN systems, digital identity, sharing, monitoring and evaluation work, etc., where small things make a big difference. What's the syntax? What are the codes and IDs? Are you using an aid agency ID or a government ID? Are you using what's included in a family? What kind of semantics are you using? Is it extended family? Is it immediate members? And then what's the kind of structure? So are you talking about the head of the household being the husband? Are you talking about grandparents, and then you have parents and children on different levels? How does that work when you're looking at data and input of data? And then protocol. How are things sent? How is it encrypted? Are you using a cloud-based system, or are you using Dropbox or what have you? So these things seem small until you hit them, and then they seem very big and they take a lot of time
Jen,
and effort
if I can
and
actually go back to
and
that,
change. So it's definitely worth
I've worked with
thinking
a
about
couple of
these from the
programs
start.
within the aid sector, and I think this also goes more broadly, but one of the challenges with all of these is they require money to fix them. And as a result, for many of these integration challenges, you're often competing with the budgets for IT people, for legal people, et cetera. And so it's not simply a matter of coming up with the technology solutions, but it's also getting people to invest in the technology solutions, getting people to invest in the infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And so oftentimes that puts you in competition with other programs within these organizations. So you not only have to sell the idea in abstract, but you have to sell the idea to the organization as a priority against their other priorities. And that can be a real challenge. Hey, Jen, we also had a question from Nela that might be worth covering at this point. And they were asking about building trust across organizations from different sectors, like government, you know, civil society, private sector. Any thoughts on what you've seen as ways to help advance trust when really you're dealing with very different types of beasts?
Yeah, and Dan, please feel free to jump in here too. So, so certainly something that I do is just finding the kinds of people in these organizations who want to do what you're doing. And I think, Dan, you'll be talking about this in a minute. But finding the people, there are often people in organizations who can move across teams and organizations, and there are people who can't. So finding the right kind of person who's able to, hustle is the wrong word, but able to kind of stretch out their fingers more broadly. I think I've often done kind of actor maps where you are putting, almost putting actors on post-it notes on a piece of, on a table and saying, how do I shift this actor slightly more in this direction rather than being up here? Or how do I find a way to move the government slightly more in this direction? And so just being very intentional about that, and being very clear on the fact that it's not easy. Finding spaces where people can be equal. So I really enjoy something we did in Uganda was creating different places to convene diverse organizations, and not saying we're going to do it, but we can do it at the Google Hub this time, and then we can do it at the Facebook Hub next time, and the Salesforce Hub next time, and creating that kind of shared vision and shared mission, and implementing your ecosystem in a way that shows that. Because a lot of the time, you're just running and you're saying, oh, it will be easier and cheaper to do it here. But the decisions you make, the places you meet, the things you say, you have to be really serious about having having
I
that
think
kind
the
of,
other thing
or
is that
creating
it really
that mission.
helps to understand
Because
who the
people
other
very quickly
actors
know
are.
if you're not
And
authentic.
this is where I think having a systems view can really help. But understanding what somebody can and cannot do. If you're asking somebody to do something impossible, or you're asking them to do something that is fundamentally in conflict with the way their organization thinks, behaves, or acts, you're going to end up with a case of, conflict that's going to batter at trust. And so I think part of trust is simply investing enough time to understand the other organizations so that you can understand what they can and cannot do, what matters to them, what things that they can let slide, and essentially avoiding the fight in the first place is often one of the best ways to move forward. And I think a key part of avoiding the fight in the first place is having somebody whose job it is actually to think about these sorts of things. And so the final element in our 5-part model here is really somebody to make things work. And we call this manage operations, but that really understates it, because what we're really saying is you need somebody to create flexibility and dynamic change with a system that is itself already pretty complex. So, Jen, let's go to the next slide. You really need somebody who's approaching the challenge of making this collaboration work from the big picture. And so big picture is in many ways synonymous with systems thinking from our perspective. It really helps you see all the parts that are in place, understand how they are different, but also understand how they interact with one another. And that requires a different type of skill. So traditionally, organizations tend to hire 2 types of people in sort of mid-management levels. One is somebody who is a manager skilled in organizing and delivering projects on time. They have strong organizational skills, and they can track work and make sure that things are compliant with a plan. The other is an engineer or expert who has subject matter expertise around a particular domain, and based on their past experience and based on their detailed knowledge of the way this practice has worked, they can really bring you the right solution that's been proven over time. And for organizations that are operating in that top-down control environment, these are really 2 key skills: the managerial skill and the subject matter expert skill. When we're dealing with a collaborative ecosystem where we're building a system that's going to flex and has multiple actors that are all different from each other, we need a new type of skill. And that's really what we've called a choreographer. And this is somebody whose key capabilities are around vision, the ability to see the big picture, and the ability to learn and adapt as that system changes. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about what choreographers do and who they are. So the job of a choreographer could, in many ways, be hardly more different than the job of a manager or a subject matter expert. First, their key goal is, in many times, to see dangers and threats early, to see opportunities out ahead, and to, as a result, make pivots that avoid those. Rather than cleaning up messes after they've happened, their job is to look across the system and see where things are potentially going to have trouble and address those in ways that involve all the different actors. So when they're making those pivots, that's not something where they're command and control being able to tell somebody what they're going to do. They're going to work with many different people to try to make those changes. They'll also be looking ahead at strategic opportunities. So they're not simply trying to avoid being hit by a bus, they're trying to get to a great destination. And so they're going to be looking for new possibilities and new opportunities, and being able to pursue unexpected opportunities that occur along the way. One of the great joys of working with a systems collaboration is oftentimes the things that are most exciting, that deliver the greatest value, are things you never had on your radar at the very beginning. And of course, to take advantage of those, as we talked about in many of the prior sessions, there is this need to learn and adjust the system as you go. So you're going to have to continually revise not only specific activities, but how the people collaborate together, how the entire collaboration of organizations works. So this kind of highly flexible, forward-looking vision is not the same personality type that works well for managing your your plan, your project plan. Typically, these individuals will have a history of what we call rogue creation. They will be running off the reservation and doing things that are not fully sanctioned or fully on the radar yet. They'll cross silos within large organizations and go outside the bounds of normal connections. They'll often be rescuing injured puppies by rescuing initiatives that are out there that need help. And if you just had a big picture, you could figure out how they would all work. And frequently, they'll do all of these things without formal mandates. So they're very much typically believers of asking for forgiveness rather than permission. And so these rogue creators are generally driven by a passion for action. They really want it to make things happen by connecting and interacting with people. Now, a key tool in them being able to do that is that they act as persuasive storytellers. So they work to not only provide people the technical tools that they need to succeed, but rather by providing them the inspirational and the narrative tools that they need to believe. All right, let's go on to the next slide. What we end up with in all of this then is a powerful new tool by seeing ecosystems as a way that you can build and bring together multiple skills and capabilities to address complex problems. But it also requires us to, as Frank has noted in the chat, to bring together a lot of capabilities to build these collaborations. And we need to use systems thinking to see how all the parts fit together, to basically align the vision, to create a set of win-win architectures, to build a dynamic trust, to integrate across a flexible architecture like this, and finally to provide the kind of management leadership that is based on big picture visioning. And so that's really the end of our 4 sessions. It's been great to have you here. If you look up at the beginning of the chat, we've got our email addresses. Please feel free to email us. We'd be happy to share the videos, which I understand are being recorded. We've also got the 9 questions if you'd like to do that, or we'd just be happy to chat with you. So do we have any? I think we've kind of got our questions answered. If anybody has one last question, we've got 2.5 minutes left. Jenny, in the meantime, any closing words?
Just that I think this is really exciting cutting edge work. So certainly Dan and myself look across what's being done, there is a hole where you start to get to bigger problems that are not well defined. And there are different kinds of organizations and people who are filling this with systems thinking.